Okay, so I've got this scene set up with a few materials and some basic light fixtures, but now I want to go further into all the different lighting options that you have with Revit. And so I'll start again with these light fixtures that I have on the ceiling, and you can see that they are attached to the ceiling, and if you missed that when I was placing them, they're downlight spots. And one interesting thing that you'll notice with those is that they have some different types set up which can be set to different angles. And so you can see here, if I select one of those lights, I can change the light type to a different tilt. This one's the 90-degree tilt. So I'm going to change to the 60-degree tilt, and then I'll just zoom in so that you can see that the angle of the light fixture is changing. So I'll just change it back so you can see a different angle. So it's rotating that light fixture, and it's actually rotating the light source as well, which might give you an indication that the light source, or the thing emitting, the emitter is what it's called, the thing emitting the light is directional. So I'm going to go to Edit Family while that light's selected, and then you can actually see that directional light source. So it's the shape of a cone, and that's typical with the spotlight. And if we go to elevation view, then you can see the angle. So here it is again at 90 degrees. I'm going to go and change the tilt angle in family types to, we'll go to 60 degrees again. And then you can see that it's actually rotating that light source. And then notice as well that it's got two parts. It's got this inner cone, and then it's got the outer cone. So if I go back, I'm just going to close this file. And then if I go back and render that, I'll change maybe this light over here to be facing the wall. So I'm just going to press space, which is a shortcut to rotate most families. So if you don't know that one, it's the handy one to try. Just pressing spacebar there flips at 90 degrees. It varies with different families, so just be aware of that. You still sometimes will need to use rotate. So here though I've got that, again, perpendicular to the wall. Now if I change the tilt, hopefully that's facing away from the wall, so I'm going to press space twice to make it point towards the wall. And then I'll do a quick render again, and I'm going to change the option there to region, and then just choose the area where we can see what those lights are going to do. Just going to render a smaller area there, and I'll leave it on interior artificial only. Okay, so you can see that light pointing towards the wall, and then over here you can actually see part of that cone of light hitting this wall over here. Now, just to save time, so I don't have to show all of this in Revit, I'm going to take this file into 3ds Max and show you the same light there where we can look at it in real time. So I'm going to go onto the main menu and just go to Suite Workflows, and then 3ds Max Design Interior Rendering. Click Run. And then I already have 3ds Max open, so I'm going to choose Active 3ds Max Session and then just choose the file that I've already got open. Okay, so I've got my Revit model in 3ds Max now. I'm going to type the shortcut C, which will set the camera view that I had in Revit. So I've got this light selected. I'm going to go to the Tools menu and then go to the Light Lister. And then you can see all of the lights in my scene. And I've got another downlight in there, which I'm just going to turn off. and then I'm going to change the graphics mode there to high quality. It's going to take a minute. Oh, now it's crashed. That's great. Okay, so I'll have to open that again. These graphics cards should cope with this, but I think they're struggling a bit, so I might just show you in a blank scene or a simpler scene. Shouldn't really have too much trouble with this file, it's not that big. Oh yes, they actually came from Max. That's a really good point. Yep, those Revit lights always work in Max because the software or the programming came from Max originally. So when you bring a Revit light into Max, it's as though it's been made in Max. Yep. Yeah, well, or change them to V-Ray lights. Mentor lights do work with V-Ray, but it's not perfect. Yeah, V-Ray lights do work better if you want to use V-Ray. That's right. Exactly. You keep because yeah, that's right. You get the light fixtures. So even though I might use V-Ray for rendering, I'll still always put the lights in Revit, bring that into Max, and then yeah. So you can actually change the Mentor lights into V-Ray lights. So I'll just make a slightly simpler scene here, just to show you those light properties individually. It's a lot clearer when you see it in Max. So I'm going to make a what's called a target light in 3ds Max, and you'll see it has all the same options as a Revit light, because as I was saying, it actually came from Max originally. So I'm going to change this to a spotlight. And then the property I'm adjusting here is the hotspot or the beam angle. So I'm going to bring that out, and then I'm just going to change the graphics options there so we can see that. So there we are. So you can see it much more clearly in Max once you've got that in real time. In other words, it's showing immediately as I make the change. I don't have to render it. And so now, if I bring this field angle out or make that bigger, it's going to fade to a wider circle, and then I'll change the beam angle or the hotspot angle, and as that becomes closer to the field angle, you can see that the edge becomes harder. Okay, so if I'll bring that field angle in a bit more. So if you want a really hard edge spotlight, you make those two angles a similar value. If you want a soft edge, nice soft edge to your light, then you make the field angle a lot bigger than the beam angle or the hotspot angle. Okay, and when you can see it in real time, it's fairly simple. But then in Revit, you won't see that in real time unless you can, but it's much harder. So you just need to know that there are those two different angles, what they do, and you can see it here in the family. We've got those two angles. And then it's actually in the light properties. You'll see it in the family when you go to family types here. Okay, so you can scroll down and you can see there we've got the field angle and the beam angle. But then in the project file, you won't even see those two cones, but you still have those same properties. So if I go again to edit type, scrolling down, notice I've got the beam angle and the field angle there that I can still adjust. So if I make the, I'll just make the field angle 31. So it's just a tiny bit bigger than the beam angle. And it doesn't like that, so I'll try a different angle. Sometimes you've got to make them a bit further apart, so I'll try 35. Yep, that's okay. So if I render now, I'm going to get a much harder edge to the light. But again, with Revit, you need to render usually to see that. So you can see there it's got that much harder edge. Okay, so again, going back, I'll increase that value. Okay, so you may not need to adjust those angles, but it's important that you have some understanding of that so that you understand how a directional light works and the fact that it needs to have a shape. Generally it is a cone shape. You can get pyramid shaped directional lights as well. So it gives you a square shape on the ground and the shape that comes out is a pyramid. That makes sense? But they normally are cones because it's a circle if it's a spotlight. And so can you think of any other lights that are directional apart from spotlights like this? There's one you'd use all the time. What about downlights? Okay, even though downlights tend to point down, they are still directional. So that's another common directional light that you'll use all the time. So I'm going to close this file. And so these lights here that don't need to have an angle, I'm going to change to more standard downlights rather than being spotlights. So I can just select those. I'm just using Control to select them. And then I can go to Edit Type and then Load. And then in lighting, you'll see there is a downlight recessed can family, which is pretty good. So I'll show you that. And I'll render the whole thing now. So you'll see those downlights that you've probably been using quite a lot already. They do have a field angle and a beam angle as well. Okay, so I'll adjust those. So if I select one of those lights and then go to Edit Type, scrolling down, you can see there we've got the beam angle fairly low, so that's 30 degrees. I'll make that 50 to get more of a spread out light. So the field angle's the outer cone, and then the beam angle's the inner cone. Yeah. Okay, so you can see then that my spotlights are still very bright. These lights over here that are close to the wall, we can see the effect on the walls, but on the floor there, we're not really getting enough light. So aside from the distribution, you then also have the intensity, which is the brightness. So if I select this light, then again go to Edit Type. Going down further, you've got the initial intensity. That's actually your intensity. I know it says initial intensity, but just think of it as your overall brightness or intensity. So if we go to there and look at the options, you've got wattage as an option. And is that something that you'd be familiar with? I'm sure you've all bought light bulbs. And so you'd have some idea of wattages. What sort of wattage would you get now on an efficient fluorescent light? 70, would that high, do you think?
No, I'm thinking like 30.
Yeah, 30 or even 15,
Yeah.
12. Yeah, that's right. Exactly, that's right. Exactly. They have the brightness of a 75 watt. That's right. Exactly, exactly. Because the wattage was never a measure of brightness, it's a measure of power consumption. So the newer, more efficient lights use less power to get the same brightness, so you need to know the efficiency as well if you want to work with a wattage, which is much harder than just working with a single value. So it's usually easier to change it to luminous flux, which gives you a value in lumens. And a lumen is sometimes called a metric candle, okay, because the old way of giving a brightness was with candelas. So when you see that unit CD, CD is candela, and a candela is roughly equal to a candle. Right? So it's like horsepower, so it's an old imperial measurement. And so this is roughly 1100 candles. Again, when you go to lumens, lumens are a bit less than candelas. So 855 lumens is the same as about 1100 candles. And that's not bright enough, so I'm going to make that 1200. And yeah, 1200 lumens. So then I'll just go render again, and we should see more light, a little bit more light in this area.
What about warm sunset?
Oh yeah, we'll get onto that as well. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so I've got then quite a few lights on the ceiling. I don't really want to add too many more. In real life I might, but I just want to give you some other ways of doing this. So, so those are directional lights. Then you'll find you have things like pendant lights. So I'm just going to go and get another light family. And I'll just go to the default lighting folder so that you can, so I'm using lights that you can all find. So I'm going to just select one of these pendant lights. So the disc or the hemisphere, any of these really, maybe the linear if it was more of an office, but I'll go for the, I think the hemisphere. And I'll just place one in the middle of that row. So now if I go back and render again, you can see there's my pendant light. I'll just render before showing you properties. Okay, so you can see that's emitting light in all directions. So it's getting some on the ceiling, which isn't the best actually, but that's what it does. It's also giving light out in left, right, up and down. So if I select that light and then go and look at the family, you can see, oh, it's actually, sorry, it's just going down, but it is actually doing some things up as well, which is a problem. So, so this light here has a hemispherical distribution. So when you see that yellow light source, up on the ribbon you'll see the light source definition. And then you can see there it's actually coming from a point, but then the distribution down here is hemispherical. So if I change it to, again, the cone-shaped distribution there, that's, again, a directional light. And then the first option there is spherical, which is emitting in all directions. So they're your main distributions. The final one there is web. That's actually the most realistic, but for that you really need a file that gives the distribution, and that's a bit harder to use. That's the one I use most in 3ds Max, but in Revit it's a little bit more difficult. So then you also have the emit from option, so whether it's a line, point line, plane or sphere. So in this case, I might try out circle for the emit from and then put it back to spot if I wanted just to go down, and that would take the light off the ceiling. And now you can see there it's actually coming tilted. That's all to do with the parameters. So a little tip I can give you there is just go to light family types, and then you can adjust the tilt angle there. I'll put it back to 90. And then I'll load back that in to the family and render that one again. And a really good tip I can give you about lighting that someone who did lighting for a living for Disney told me is that do as many lights directional as you can. They're easier to control, they look better, and they render much, much faster. So you've got light only going in a certain direction rather than going everywhere. It's going to use much less computing power to process and calculate, and again, generally easier to control. Notice how even the parts on the ceiling here look better already. So directional lights are a good option, but sometimes you do need some omnidirectional lights. In other words, lights that emit in all directions. And so one that you really should know about is studio light. So you can see there, the light's a bit uneven. I can play around with the lighting intensities to compensate for that. But then often a good trick that you can use is to add in, again, what's called a studio light. That's just a Revit light family. So I'm going to go again to component, load family, and then in the lighting folder, you'll always be able to find this light called Studio Light. Now I've seen some people use this as their only light, which I would never recommend because it actually looks pretty bad, and can be really hard to control. But just having one or two can help a lot with all of your renders. Yeah. So again, if I place this Studio Light in the middle roughly, now you can see here, notice how it's not coming up. That's another Revit thing. When you've placed a family previously, even if you've just loaded it again, you need to choose it from the list over here. So if I scroll down, then I know I'll be able to find the Studio Light. There it is. I'm just going to place it roughly in the middle of this space. Yep, in floor plan, that's right, exactly. Yep. Now I can't see it because it's too high for this floor plan, but that's okay. I can go to this section view.
Why do it only on floor plan and not ceiling plan?
I could do it in other. If I'd placed it in the ceiling plan, I might have been able to see it. Yep. But sometimes it'll be in between. So it's good to adjust it in the section no matter what. Yeah. Okay, so there's my Studio Light floating above everything. And the good tip I can give you about Studio Lights is keep them clear of surfaces. Otherwise it's too obvious that there's a big ball of light floating in the middle of the space. So I'm going to bring it down a little bit so it's not too close to the ceiling. I don't want it too close to the bar. That's right. So now I can see there's the Studio Light floating in the middle of the space, but we won't see it when it renders. So if I go and render now, we're going to get more even lighting. Notice how much more light I get. And that's probably too much, and it is actually still giving me some light up on the ceiling there, which I don't want. So I'll go back and adjust the light properties. So the most obvious problem is the brightness. So again, with the initial intensity, looking at the lumens there, notice how high that is. And so the more you do this, the more of a handle you'll get on what those values mean. So remember the previous light ended up with a value of around 1200 lumens. It started with 800, so that's sort of the range I'd want to be working with. So I'll go for 1000, roughly, and see how that looks. Okay, so you can see much more even. I don't have those big pools of light. Okay, and so then I might even go further and make that light even dimmer.
So you only use those ones to light up your room.
That's right, it's just for extra light. And so now this one should be not so noticeable on the ceiling even. And there we are. Okay, so then I'll go back and I might just copy that a few times. Okay, so then also you've got the colour, which Chris was mentioning as well, which is a really good thing to think about. So light colour is really interesting because there are several ways of doing it, of setting the colour. So you can see how this looks fairly warm. Yeah, that's right, yeah. So now I might just, before I go too much further with this, put in a few more lights and then I'll come back to adjust that that temperature. So a few more so you can actually see the colours a little bit more clearly. So I'm just putting these lights over near that wall. And then I as well. Okay, so I've got a few more lights in there now, and I'll render that again. And yeah, so those just need to come down a little bit. That's better. Okay, so it's also a bit dim. So once that's finished, I'm going to go to adjust the exposure. And then I'll make it a bit brighter. Oops, that's too bright. A little bit. And then I'm also going to adjust the white point. So the white point value gives you a global temperature control. So if I take this to the left, I'll go maybe a bit further. You can see that's much cooler. So it's taken out a lot of those orange and red tones. If I take it to the right, that'll make it warmer. But again, that's global. You can do that individually with each light as well. So I'm just going to get close to a neutral. That's pretty close. Okay, so now if I select one of the lights, I'll start with the spotlights because they're the most obvious, and then edit type. When you go down to the photometrics panel, it's below the initial intensity. You've got the initial color. Okay, so lighting colors always given in Kelvin, so degrees Kelvin, which is measured from absolute zero, essentially, as far as I understand it. And again, it is a temperature value. So this is the colour of the light in, well, very high temperatures because they are hot and it's higher than the sort of temperatures that you'd normally be used to dealing with. So they're in thousands of degrees. And have you worked with Kelvin values before for lighting? No? Okay. So maybe just to give you a rough idea, 1 or 2,000 is very low. Neutral is around 5,000. And then anything higher than that is cool. So low is warm, high is cool, and then neutral, which is roughly in the middle, is about 5,000, depending on how it's working, 5 to 6,000, sometimes even up to 6,500. Now, you don't need to remember all of that at first because it'll give you the values with these presets here. So notice how here it's got D50. D50 is reference white. Remember I said 5,000 is neutral? So that sets the temperature there to 5,000. You can see, notice that still looks a little bit orange. So that's actually, I think of it more as an off-white, but that is actually called neutral. D65 is another reference white. Notice how that's a much cooler white. So that's 6,500, which is quite a high value, but still is considered neutral. Halogen is a very warm light, so that's 3,000. Do you know any lights that are very cool? Fluorescent, yeah. So fluorescent, if you go to fluorescent, they're cool, they're warmer than you might think, though.
Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah. They used to be considered a fairly cool light, but that's because a lot of the older lights were very warm. So fluorescence, this is one of the cooler fluorescents. That's still only 4,200. If you go for the fluorescent daylight, that's higher. So that's the really cool fluorescents. They're 6,400,
So,
which is still just within the neutral range. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's right. I mean, these would be a bit below that. These wouldn't be daylight. These would be around 5,000, I'd say. So one of these, cool white or warm white. No, cool white I'd say is about the closest. 4200, yeah, something like that. So xenon is a very cool light, 6000. Incandescent, you're probably all used to. That's a very warm light. The high pressure sodiums are warm as well. Phosphor mercury, another warm one. So they're warehouse industrial lights. Quartz is fairly neutral. Okay, so again, you don't need to remember these, but you want to try and familiarise yourselves with them as you go through them, and this is the way you'll specify lights. If you're wondering why people choose different kinds of lights, apart from the power consumption, it is often to do with the temperature. So LEDs are actually fairly neutral, but they vary a little bit. Okay, so that's the colour of the light, and it shows you that you can't get every colour. You don't get the full colour range. Because they're all very close to white, our eyes are getting bombarded with a lot of photons essentially. So you can't see all of the colours when it's at that temperature range. So again, the range is from orange to blue, which is, it's similar to what you see normally in the visible spectrum, but it works a bit differently. So how do you think then you make coloured lights if it's not done this way? This gives you definitely some effect on the colours and the temperature, but then if you see a purple light, is it being done with the temperature of the light, do you think? No. That's right, you use a filter. So a gel or something gets put over the top of the light, coloured glass essentially, and that, yeah. No, you can't do it with the temperature, it's not possible. Yeah. So this is the photons coming from the light source. So if you want to have a purple light, then you add a filter over the top. So you've got the filter here. Yeah. And that will reduce the brightness of the light, right? Because it's filtering out a lot of the colours. So if you want that sort of effect, you need to understand how the colour works, the initial colour, and then the filter goes over that. So if I render this now, we'll see that purple, yeah. And you need to use a bit of trial and error to get the... Oh yeah, you can do some amazing things when you get confident with it. There we are. And coloured light can be really effective, especially for nighttime renders, but in lots of situations. It can look really good. Yeah, you can do lots of things, yeah. So, so you've got, you've got quite a lot of, few other options there that are more to do with the physics. The one I'll say you probably want to avoid is the light loss factor, unless you really want to get into the physics of your lights. I know it might look like you have a lot of good options there, but it's very technical. And if you get into the physics of lighting, it's an extremely technical thing. You should never be adjusting the light loss factor generally. It's just not a good idea. So I'm just pointing that out so you know to avoid it generally. Even though it might seem like a dimmer, it doesn't work that way in real life. It affects the physics of the light. Yes, the only other thing I wanted to mention there is the hosting. So remember, I think I've showed you this a few times already. The lights that I've been placing are ceiling hosted. But what if you have something like this, where you want to have a light attached to something that isn't a ceiling? So I've actually got over here to the left a space where I have a floor, but no ceiling. So just remember that I made those lights that you can use that aren't ceiling hosted, even though they look like ceiling lights. So I'll just go to the ceiling plan and I'll grab a couple of those. Okay, so if you've forgotten what they're called, so there's the square unhosted downlight and the round unhosted downlight. So the round unhosted works just like the spotlight that I've just shown you. The square one is even simpler. So I'll just place that there so that you can see. And then in section, let's move this over. Okay, so you can see it's a floating light. You can easily adjust the height of it, and it renders just like any other light. See it over there? I know it's big, but you can easily adjust the size. So obviously the brightness needs to be adjusted, but otherwise that should work pretty well. And then another one that I've made that might be handy is a floating tube. So again, in that same library.
Also, you can put it underneath.
Exactly, for recessed lighting. That's right, exactly. Yep. So I've just called it standalone bulb linear. So I'll just place that under the bar here. Now I haven't made a recess section, so I'm just going to have that floating underneath the bar. And I'll just move that around to the side.
You can put it on the floor if you want.
Exactly, anywhere you want, yep. Okay, so now we should see the effect of that light coming from under the bar.
Can you put it vertical?
Oh yes, of course, yep. Yep, you can rotate it. Okay, so again, a bit bright, but you can definitely see the effect there. So again, now I can just go back and maybe I'll select it in wireframe, edit type, and again look at the initial intensity, change it to lumens, 3000, that's probably a bit too much, so I'll make that 1200. And then this one over here, again, I'll make less bright. Yeah, lighting fixtures. Lighting fixtures. So there we are. Okay, so that's still a bit too bright, so I'll reduce that even further. And you'll find there's a lot of fine-tuning with your lighting brightness. And just keep fine-tuning it, because even small changes will make a big difference. And I can tell you a number of times I've had to go in and fine-tune the lights by 5 lumens at a time, and then just re-render to see that little change. Yeah, pretty much, yeah. Oh yeah, it does look better than materials, yeah. Yeah, lots of things. You should be able to do what's called image-based lighting, in other words, rendering essentially with the materials. But yeah, you're right, it doesn't work as well as using the lights generally. So I just want to show you one last thing with these lights. Okay, so I'm putting it back to a point where you can see the light fixture in the render. Okay, so notice how it gives a strange distribution, even though it's a linear light. That's quite normal with Revit to get this sort of distribution. So I'm going to show you why that happens as well. It's all to do with that, what I was showing you at first, the distribution. So I'll just change, so I can select the light. Okay, so notice how the light does have a linear distribution, and it's set to be hemispherical, so that shouldn't have that distribution that we can see in the render. It's a well-known problem with Revit rendering. Now with the cloud it won't be so bad, but also if you set it to higher quality in Revit, it should resolve most of those issues. There is a setting if you go to advanced as well in here in the custom settings, that should fix it. But it will then take longer to render. You can see now it's going much more slowly.
What's the name of that?
Oh, so that was in the custom settings. In the custom render settings. So notice how now I don't have that big bright pool of light. It's more of an even distribution. But the render's going to take much longer.
Oh, it looks nice.
Yeah. So, yeah. So just make sure you know about that, so you don't worry if you see these points of light. If you're doing a lot of recessed lighting, that's natural. But again, on the higher render quality, it should resolve that.
So what's the name of the guy?
So that's the standalone bulb linear. That's right. Yeah. Okay, so notice how now it's more of an even spread. Okay, we'd have to wait quite a lot longer for the render. Okay, so maybe while that's happening, I'll just quickly show you a couple of little things in Max. So just to revise those different lighting distributions, in Max, you have all the same options. So here this is diffuse, lighting evenly in all directions. And I'll put some other objects here so that you can see. Okay, so I've just made a quick scene in here so that you can see the distributions, and here we'll make that intensity greater, and then you can see it is lighting all of the surfaces there. Maybe we'll make that box a bit smaller. There it is. So then the other option is, so that's uniform spherical. So that's lighting again evenly in all directions. It's probably a bit too bright. I'll just reduce that. But then in Max, if you set the distribution to linear, bring that closer to the ground. So I'm going to set, the emit from to line, and we'll make that line a bit longer. This might give you an idea why people tend to use Max for professional work more than Revit. I can then set the light distribution there to, say, diffuse, and it will light evenly from a line, and we'll even just make that visible just to prove that to you. But maybe I'll make it a cylinder. So we're looking right at it. I'm just going to rotate that so it's not so strange. So you can see there's my cylinder. Make the radius a bit less so it's more like a tube. Yeah, so that's working like a real tube of light, which is a bit more than what Revit can do, but it's similar in a way. And then from there it's very bright, so I'll just reduce that down. So if I put that up against the wall, maybe then you can see. Yeah. Oh, you get a lot more control in Max than in Revit. Yeah.
So can you do everything in Revit and import it here?
Of course, if you bring your Revit model into Max, then it works exactly the same. Yeah. You get a lot more control in Max, but again, in the end, Revit will look pretty good if you spend time on it, and you get most of the options. Just a few of those little things, mainly to do with distribution, don't work the same. So, so maybe I'll leave this one rendering, but the final thing I'll say there is that lights are a particular kind of family in Revit. So you need, the only way to make a light in Revit is to use the lighting family, and there are restrictions. So you'll see there are some families that have downlights or track lighting with several lights in the one family. That's never going to work. Okay, because again, a light in Revit has to be made using a Revit lighting family. And so that only gives you the option to adjust one set of lighting values. So if you've got a track light that's got 5 lights in there, it's not possible to adjust 5 lights. You can only have one light property in a lighting family. So the only way to make track lighting, say if you've got a track light that has 5 lights on it, you need to use 5 light families. And it's that simple, you just copy them. And that actually makes it easier, because then you can use almost any lighting family and then just copy them and then model the track in as a separate thing. Just model the track as an extrusion, and then it's fairly easy. So you can just use the regular spotlight family, and it works pretty well. Okay, so that's probably do it for lighting. We can obviously spend a lot more on that, and if you go into, again, Max, or then go further into V-Ray, V-Ray is all about lighting, and Maxwell Render is another one that gives you some really interesting options for lighting. But Revit's a good way of getting started, so just make sure you know how to get into those options, have a look at your lighting families, and then maybe the last thing I'll say there is that a lot of the lighting families that you download won't be set up properly, and often aren't really worth using for rendering. They're good for the lighting fixtures, whether it's a chandelier or something else that you might have trouble modelling them, it's definitely worth using them. But to get the actual light for rendering, usually you don't need to use any special families that you download, because there are only a few different options for lighting in Revit. As long as you know how to get to those options in a lighting family, it's fairly easy to adjust them. Yeah, and you shouldn't need to use tricky lights that you download for your rendering. Normally they're actually going to get in the way, and you're better off just using the lights from the normal default library like I've been here, and just make sure you know how to adjust those properties for rendering. That's the most important thing.